Welcome back to the podcast. I'm here with my co-host, Jared Wilson. Really excited about today's episode. We're bringing in Daniel Guzman, who is a performance coach, formerly with LAFC as well as the Galaxy, and worked with the U.S. men's national team as well. So, Daniel, can you just kind of describe, who you are and what you do?
Yeah, no, pleasure. Thanks for having me on, guys. Excited for the conversation today. So I'm just a performance coach. I think that term gets thrown around a lot, like what does a performance coach actually do? And for me, what that means is that I like to take whatever the sport is and take the weight room stuff, the stuff in the field might be speed stuff, and then the actual training and the skills. So for me, that's soccer. That's where I worked really heavily in. And in soccer, like how can I connect what I want to do on the performance side to what they actually have to do on the field and make a connection there.
Cool. Well, we appreciate you taking the time. I would say kind of the first thing that I wanted to ask you is what do you do now, and how what do you do like on a day-to-day basis, and how does that impact kind of what your vision is for your future?
Yeah, no, good question. I mean, first thing is I'm a dad. I got 3 kids, so like constantly running around after those kids and trying to raise them the ways that I think they should be raised. On the professional side, working in the genetics space a little bit more, trying to understand some of the questions that strength coaches or even any other coach or medical staff, they're trying to answer. Like, how can I help my athlete recover faster? How can I help them be more robust and durable to the demands that they're going to face in the game and whatever that competition is? And so by looking at genetics as the foundation, I think that's going to be more the future of where sports is going to lead. So that's just a big venture that I'm in right now, trying to help out athletes and coaches in that space.
I know we talked a little bit the other day when Stan Van Gundy tweeted out I don't remember the exact tweet, but it's basically, talking about injuries nowadays, and back in the day, they never had all these medical staffs and big budgets and all that kind of stuff. I know you kind of reached out to me, be like, hey man, do you know anyone that knows Stan Van Gundy? Can you elaborate a little bit? I know we talked about it, but elaborate a little bit on like where you were trying to go with that.
Yeah, I mean, I was just sitting at home and I thought, like, what's something that could be a challenge for the day? So I'm like, I'm going to text Jared, like, how can I get in touch with Van Gundy? Because he had these comments that people have been thinking about. Like, injuries are just rising everywhere. NBA, NFL, the Premier League had over like 534 million pounds of injury burden. So it's like these numbers are just up. And so I think Van Gundy is like, what's going on? And he had his own ideas, I think, about like, guys don't train hard enough or whatever it might be, which is fair. Like every team's trying to manage the whole like work to rest thing. But when I saw it, I thought, you know what, from what I believe now, from what I'm learning is that genetics is a starting point. And we're trying to hyper-personalize training all the time, but everyone will say, oh, that guy, he's just genetically gifted. But like, what are the actual genetics behind that? And what does it actually look like? Now, I am not an expert geneticist. I am a genetic enthusiast. I'm just trying to learn as much as I can. I'm just a coach, right? But I think by looking at that stuff, it's just more information where now we can better program for the athletes. The same way we'd say, okay, we want to do a force plate test or a speed test, body composition test. I think this has got to be part of the battery of tests to how we initially evaluate the athletes. And so with Van Gundy's comments, I just wanted to talk to him and say, hey, here's your Twitter post, here's my response to it. There was no other agenda there, just to have a good conversation. That didn't happen, but maybe one day we'll get Van Gundy on the podcast and have a conversation with him.
For sure. And then we were talking, to expand a little bit on that before, is that typically I think what you see now is like blood work, taking the blood work, urine tests, those type of things you do see in the professional settings and even down probably into the college a little bit. What would you say like the biggest difference is for like the genetic side?
I think all this stuff is super valuable. I think with those things, it takes a moment in time. Like, how does my blood panel look right now? How is my urine analysis right now? Whether we're doing hydration or whatever it might be. With your DNA, that doesn't change, right? Your genes might turn on and off and things might be exposed more depending on the environment, but your genes do not change. And so I think that's just got to be part of the conversation. It's getting more affordable. The stuff that I'm doing now with 3x4 Genetics and GENEFIT is trying to solve that. So we're excited about what that project's going to be. But it definitely has to be part of the conversation about who am I as a person. So your genetics are just a language, right? It's just a code made of 4 letters. And so as we manipulate those letters, things can change. So if something says coat, C-O-A-T, right? But I change one letter from C to G, that's goat. Well, you're not going to wear a goat anymore, right? You have a totally different thing going on. And so I think by understanding the language of who we are, that's really what I believe genetics is all about. And then we can make decisions because it's not the full story. Whether people think their genetics are more predisposed to a certain type of athleticism or whatever it might be, the encouraging thing is that for us as coaches, we control the environment, right? How can we train you better? How can we educate you on recovery? How can we help feed you better? And those can help change the outcome, which is why all of us do kind of what we do.
And I think this is really exciting because I see it as almost really the new frontier of what we do with athletes. There's the AI piece to it, artificial intelligence. I'm really excited to see what technology is going to bring as far as how that impacts kind of what you're doing with genetics or kind of the two together. What do you see as far as like AI and genetics? Is there any correlation there, or how do you see that kind of impacting just strength and conditioning as an industry?
Yeah, and I mean, think right now when I think AI, everyone's talking about Chat GPT right now, right? Like, how can I, ask a question and it just gives me all the answers? Obviously, AI is still working on the emotion side, so I think as coaches, like, we can understand empathy and connection, all that kind of stuff, where we are still the masters there, and we still have to use the intelligence to best connect with our athletes. But I think what we're doing with GENEFIT, which is the product it's the world's first product that takes your genetics with any training wearable to give you real-time feedback and training recommendations. So the artificial intelligence part of that is that the system is basically taking in whatever wearable information you are collecting, right? That can be some sort of heart rate from a watch. That can be GPS. That could be an Oura ring if you're looking at sleep data. And so it's taking that with your personal genetics to help give real-time feedback on tissue health scores and giving recommendations on how to recover better. And I think by having information like that, we still need the coach, right? The system's not just doing it for us, but it's giving us more information to help answer the question, how do I perform better on the field, and how do I recover better in between games, right? If we can solve those two things, that's huge. And of course, like, what we all believe is that performance and injury is really connected, right? There is no, you can't prevent an injury. You can't predict they're going to get injured in this moment or, all that kind of stuff. But what you can say is we know that if there's acute spikes in workload, that could lead to an injury. If there's a previous injury, then we might highlight that as a red flag, right? There might be another injury to that spot. And so all we're trying to do is gather more information so that us as coaches and with the teams and the players, we can make the best possible decision. Player feel is still going to matter. It's still going to be one of the most important things. How do they just feel in the day, right? I was just watching, there's this Netflix show, Breakpoint, I think, with these tennis players. It's really cool, just insight into how they're playing. And there was one of the Americans who did something to his ankle or his foot the day before one of the big finals. And they're like, no, you can't play, it's going to get worse. And he woke up that morning and said, I think I can play, I can do this. Like I know my body, right? So no matter what piece of data he had, whatever he felt was what's going to help him out the most. And he went out there and he won the whole thing. He beat Nadal in the championship. I thought it was just pretty cool episode to show that. So I think there's a combination of how do we use data, which is really important, but still understanding what does the coach see, what does the athlete feel, and bring that all together. That way it's not just one entity that's making the decision, right? It's everything in conjunction with each other.
Right, and at the end of the day, a coach has to have that feel and intuition too, based on the knowledge that he has and the toolboxes that he has. Or which tool is the best for this specific situation? And I don't know if that's ever going to be replaced. I don't think it is. But that's an important piece too. As maybe a young strength coach who's listening to this, is you still need to build your base of knowledge and toolbox and intuition, and have relationships with your athletes so that how your athletes communicate with you, and you can use that as an assessment in of itself, which I think is important, which, the data is going to tell you one thing, but like you said, if the athlete thinks he can go and you have a great relationship then with that athlete, then, there's your answer right there. Yeah. It's not black and white, which I think that's where the art of coaching comes in too, is understanding the gray area and the context of all the tools that you have available,
Yeah, no, I definitely see that. It's a whole approach, right? Whenever people talk about kids, takes a whole tribe to raise kids. Well, I think with athletes too. Of course, we have so many voices, so we have to think who gets a seat at the table. I think we used to talk about this. When you give someone a seat at the table, you're giving them a voice into your life. And so I always tell the young athletes, think about who is your board of directors, right? It's usually probably your parents. Maybe it's one of us as a coach. It might be a nutritionist, right? Maybe a massage therapist or a counselor or something like that, right? But you don't just give anyone in the world a seat at the table. So we have to give very, very smart and intelligent voices who we trust that seat at the table. And that's always what I come back to with that.
Yeah. I mean, to me, it's a little bit like what you said, is it's basically just another thing in our toolbox. And I think sometimes as strength coaches, we try to think this one thing is going to make my training so much better. And at the end of the day, it's just one piece to the puzzle that we're trying to fit and do the best possible job that we could do. So I know in my situation right now, that's basically what I do, is I try to find the best PTs, the best soft tissue people, the best technology, force plates, all that stuff. But if you don't have an understanding of how that can help you as a coach or a trainer or help your athlete, it's just kind of just out there. And I think some people, I'm guilty of this in the past. I hear force plates. I'm like, I got to get force plates. I know nothing about force plates. I just know they look cool if I post it, but like you got to start to try to understand some of these things. And I think that's super cool what you're talking about, like the genetic sides, is that it is just another piece, but you can't just say, oh, I'm going to give up everything else and just get this one software that, Daniel's talking about and all my athletes are going to be perfect. Yeah. 'Cause there's a lot that goes into, like you're saying, it's being a coach, the art of coaching and that on a day-to-day basis.
And I think the genetics part, and maybe you could speak on this too, because I'm really interested in continuing to hear about it, is it could be, it's another tool obviously, but it really could be the key that unlocks something that, is totally new in the industry in training athletes and reducing risk of injury. Because that, like you said, performance and injury, they're interrelated, they're interconnected, but it really is that important. And so I think it could be, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the key to kind of unlocking a totally new frontier.
When we think about genetics, we always think about like putting players in these buckets. That person is genetically gifted, right? They've got good genes, they've got bad genes. And what I'm learning is that it's not necessarily that someone has good or bad genes. I think that's probably a little inappropriate to say it that way. It's just about how do we learn what those genes mean for that person so that we can control that environment better, right? So if I know that someone is at a much higher risk of injury, right, because they've got genetic variations that puts their tendons at a lot more risk, as a performance coach, I'm going to think, okay, what can I do to help strengthen those tendons, make them more resilient, right? Could be plyometric training, could be strength training, could be collagen, vitamin C supplementation with a certain isometric protocol, right? Because that's what we found works with other stuff. And so by understanding, the insights of the athlete, then we have to make those decisions. I think that's kind of the direction that I'm going to take it. So that just gives me more of an informed choice. I don't want it to be fear-based where athletes are now scared, like, oh, I don't want to know what it means. I don't want to have any bad information. But there has to be a conversation there. There's something real. It's like anything else. We do a speed test, right? Like, you're the king of speed. And if you go to an athlete and you're like, oh, your speed's so bad, you're going to get a hamstring pull if you do this, right? You're just like, hey, here's how we can make you move better. Right. It's going to make you feel better. And so when you sprint down the line in that game, it's going to put you at a less risk of injury because of A, B, C, D.
Right.
So I think by getting some insights there on the genetic side, like for me now looking back into it, I wish I had this when I was in high school, right? So I could better train myself. I made so many mistakes. I got some injuries that I probably never should have got because I just overtrained. Jared and I actually trained at the same place in college. One of the best places to train in the world, right? And what did I do? I doubled the sets, reps, and the volume because I thought more is better, and I got a stress fracture in my tibia. And I was just, I needed a coach. I needed a strength coach to walk me through that. So I think it's just another way that we can get information to understand who we are. And the thing is, like, if you look back a couple decades ago, the Human Genome Project, it was just so expensive, right? Like to have your genetics done would cost so much money. And now for like a couple $100, you can, take a quick cheek swab and get the results back and talk to a geneticist that can walk you through, here's what these things mean. There's a ton of research out there. And it's just not something we think about. Like when we go through university, like, do we always take a course on genetics? No, we don't. I think we should. I think it's that important. It's about our body and who we are. We'll spend money to figure out, what's going to make me gain 2 seconds faster in this, or what's going to make me jump higher, which is great. But we have to do the training, right? We have to start back in the beginning. And that's where I truly believe the genes first mindset, it's what's got to be at the front for every single coach, every athlete.
Yeah, and I think kind of changing gears a little bit, how can you kind of describe to maybe a high school athlete listening to this, and to your point about you making mistakes and wishing you would have known now or knowing then what you know now, what can you give him as far as, best advice for how to prepare to be a great soccer player, just kind of in general?
Yeah, I think the first thing is that you really got to enjoy where you're playing. I just know there's so many athletes that they want to chase the badge or the jersey or, wherever they think is going to help them get to the next spot. But if you're not playing at all, well, then you're not really allowing yourself to work through the training process and have experiments in the field, like I'm going to try this or do whatever. If you're sitting on the bench, it's not helping, right? So don't worry too much about what level you're playing at. Just find a place where you can play consistently. I would start with that. When it comes to soccer, what I have learned and what I would tell any high school kid is a strength conditioning coach has to be one of your top priorities, right? You're already going to have the technical staff coaching who's going to teach you the tactical side. They're going to teach you the methodology of the style of play that club wants to play, right? That might not fit your style, but you're going to go play there, right? But how are you going to prepare your body so that you can perform the best in the field? You want to get in the best positions to score or defend or whatever that is. But if you don't understand how to move your body well, if you can't, do those movements and positions repetitively at high quality, well, that might put you at an increased risk of injury, right? Because now you're just moving dysfunctionally. That's not going to help out anyone. So I think having a strength conditioning coach who has the heart of a teacher, someone who really wants to teach and learn, I think a lot of the times, you know, you go to these training sessions, you have to understand what you're getting into. Group training is not bad. It's great, right? But you have to know I'm getting very general cues. Okay, well, if you go to that and you like what you're seeing, well, then go to Lucas or go to Jared and say, okay, how can I get a private with you or a semi-private, something where I can get a little bit more coaching to get the full gambit. Sometimes that's not everyone's price range. I get that, right? It's a business. But just showing up to a quality speed and strength session is going to be huge. You know, from the weight room side, we're trying to improve capacities in the gym that can help you for high forces on the field. On the speed side, I think we're obviously, you know, like velocity changes everything. There's nothing in here that we can do that's going to mimic a sprint, right? There's nothing else, because those velocities and those muscles, being exposed to those velocities is a whole new game. And so whenever we start, you know, talking about sprinting linearly or changing direction, we need to learn how to move well. And everyone has their own movement profile, right? But by having a qualified professional, that's going to lead them through that. I think that's quality. So thankfully, when I was growing up, my mom found a speed coach for me for everything, you know, whether it was football, basketball, soccer, baseball, I played it all. She knew that strength conditioning was going to be big, and so I found a coach, and I think that's what separated me from the rest of the pack. And so that's probably the number one thing I'd recommend to any athlete.
For as far as speed?
Yeah, 100%. Got to get a coach.
Yeah, it really is the universal language between all sports is speed. So I'd love to dive into speed a little bit.
Yeah, let's talk.
You know, how would a youth athlete get faster? What do they need to do to get faster?
Yeah, so obviously, let's say they have the coaching side. Like, what should they be looking for in a coach? I think that's a helpful way to think through, like, the questions they should be asking. Well, the first thing is make sure that they are actually going to sprint, right? It can't just be mechanics and drill all day long, right? At some point, you have to move faster than just the warm-ups. I know I've seen some programs where they're just skipping for days and days and days, and at some point, you have to let the kids sprint. So make sure you are actually sprinting, right? But then when you look at speed, like we all know, speed isn't just linear, right? Especially in soccer, like speed is chaotic, it's reactive to the ball. And so we're trying to find a happy medium where we can train speed in a non-reactive setting. It's just me point A to point B, but we can also train it reactively, right? How do I sprint when I'm going against an opponent, a human stimulus? How do I sprint when there's a ball involved? Or, you know, soccer we're talking about right now. It could be football, it could be something else. And so looking at a program that takes that holistically from a non-reactive, more pre-programmed standpoint to a reactive, chaotic standpoint, I think is key. So that's probably one of the first things I would look at. The second thing I would look at is, can you be in an environment with other athletes that really want to learn? I just think that's contagious, right? Like if you have a bunch of training partners that really want to get better, if I'm training by myself, that's one thing. I'm a motivated person, but it's not always the most fun. But if I'm training with my buddies, I can see how they do it. And so when I watch a coach elaborate on someone else's form and how they're fixing them, I think, okay, I think I kind of do that too. So now I can learn from others. It's not just about me. The last thing I would say for most athletes is the sprinting stuff you see on Instagram sometimes is way too much volume. No, like do this drill from box to box for 20 minutes straight. I'm just like, that's just not realistic, you know? Like a lot of the times, like we want to get 2 or 3 high quality sprints in a session, right? You might sprint 20 times, but you're not sprinting at max velocity. And so make sure you're in a program where you're not over sprinting and just over stressing your body because they think that they got to get your money's worth, right? Just know that sometimes like the dosage is so important. And so 2 sprints is enough, right? Trust the professional you have. It might be smaller.
And I think that's a point that I try to get across to a lot of the high school athletes that I train and college athletes that I train, that look, if you're trying to get faster, oftentimes practice in and of itself is not enough because you may not be hitting those velocities. You may not getting the quality speed work that you would, you know, in a structured speed session. So I think your point about, you know, dosing it well and then understanding that if you want to get faster, you have to sprint. You can't just drill yourself to death, which in the age of social media, you could look up 100 different speed drills, but you have to sprint. And so sometimes when people hear that, the athletes that I train, they don't really understand like, oh, I got to do this, this, and this. No, we need to go sprint, you know, and then to your point about surrounding yourself with other athletes that also have the same goal, because then you can add in competition and you can add in just competing against one another. I think that's a great point and should, I think, be a big takeaway. Look, you need a sprint outside of practice and outside of a game. Take structured time to sprint, and then having people with you or competing with a teammate or a buddy or a friend or a sibling, I think is, you know, really key too.
Let me ask you guys about this. I'm just thinking this through right now. When it comes to college athletes, are a lot of them still getting these college sprint or conditioning programs? Is that the norm right now?
As far as like the beep test and other things?
Yeah, so like what's your process? I'm curious, like when you get the program, are you revamping the whole program, or is there communication with the college, or how does that work out? Because obviously they're coming to you because they train with you in high school. What's that landscape now with college athletes?
I've been out of it now for a couple of years. And so touch on it, a few years back when I was doing it, a lot of times it was the notion of like, it was more of like a psychological battle for the athlete. Like they get this huge pamphlet. A lot of the girls that I trained were like going to college, not girls that come back from college. Because I think once you go to college and you've done the test, there's some like understanding of like, I could do that. But the younger girls or seniors in high school that are going to college and they just get sent this massive pamphlet of maybe like an 8-week program. You'd probably know better soccer offseason, but 8-week program before you got to report to camp, which is earlier than school starts. And you're already nervous about leaving your family. You're nervous about going to college. And then you get this like beep test. You got to have this random number score that they just have come up with for the different positions. And, then they hear stories of like, if you don't get that number, you don't get to play. Then you got, the 300-yard shuttle. It's like, 8 maybe tests they got to do on top of everything else. So at least for me, when I was doing it, it was more of like an understanding of like, look, you're fit. You're able to do this, and let's just train properly, and you're going to be prepared for that. Because I think the biggest mistake a lot of people that I saw do, they would come to me, they're like, I've already ran 7 beep tests. I'm like, you're 2 weeks into your off season. They're like, I'm doing it every other day just so I can get better. I'm like, that's not real training.
And is it going to prepare you for what preseason is going to be like?
And that's what I would try to talk to them. It was like, that you're not preparing you for soccer. You're not preparing for anything else. And they would say like, I'm so tired after. It's so hard to do anything. So you're not developing your skill. It's hard for you to lift now. Yeah. And so that's basically what I do, is just try to help them navigate through their pamphlet. And obviously there's some stuff in there that you want to do because you're going to that college, their strength coach. So you want them to be adequate and, able to do the skills that they're asking. But just have an understanding of like, it's not the end of the world. You're going to be fit enough to do it. And they kind of could take a deep breath and I think every girl I've ever had has passed the beep test.
What's interesting?
Easy.
I was just thinking this through, like the goalkeepers too have to do all the beep tests and stuff, like, which is fine. They got the beep test, but then you see the goalkeepers doing the endurance stuff and everything. And so I just think maybe there's an opportunity to have a conversation, like what does a summer packet look like? Or what I started doing with the pro athletes, it's a smaller off season. We will write them a program. What I tell them is sometimes it's good to get variety. So like go hire Lucas. Like I just will trust someone like that. And we should actually instead have these people in our networks. I know we need to have some control, but I'm almost going against it. Like, let's take less control and just say, go work with someone for 8 weeks. We'd rather have you do that where you're seeing a coach, you're getting whatever feedback you might need. They're seeing what you need on a daily basis. I'm not going to be with you, right? I live in California and you're in New York right now. I just think there's a conversation around that which probably puts the value of like, go hire a strength coach. Spend the money. Do that in the summer. That's going to put you so much further ahead for the preseason to come.
As opposed to trying to just muddy through the program on their own?
Yeah, I think so. Like I get there's a community side to it. But I think like we could just put everyone in a group chat or something and just say, hey, is everyone doing their work? I know it takes a lot of trust, right? But I think college athletes want to work hard, right? Like they're not just going to sit at home. They don't want to do nothing. They want to train. They want to be prepared, especially this day and age.
I think the hard part is, and this might be a touchy subject, but do you think the quality of strength coaches is out there?
Well,
because my point is that a quality strength coach is obviously going to be more expensive than a not so quality strength coach. Yeah. And so a few of the girls I have gotten over the time are coming from, say, another strength coach or from something else. But the first thing they always say is like, I can't afford you. And so it's kind of this hard thing because like you want to help the athlete, you want to help the human, but it's also, it's also a business. So it's kind of like, and I would say that what you just said is from the world I'm in now, the professional world, is a rare statement to say.
Yeah, I think you have to vet out who that network of coaches is.
Yeah.
And
which takes time.
Man, you know what? I don't know, Lucas, I don't know what you think. What I'm feeling more is like, is it more about quality strength coaches or quality speed coaches? Like coaches that know movement. Like you don't have to be just speed or just strength. You can be it all. But do you understand how athletes are supposed to move with certain demands, right? So if I'm doing a max velocity sprint versus acceleration versus I'm doing a change of direction, like I think that part for me, it's probably more difficult. At least when I was first learning as an intern, like the strengths, like, okay, I get that. I can teach you how to move and do a squat and an RDL. There's little nuances, but like when it came to the speed stuff, I was like, what? How is this coach seeing all these different, like what is he talking about? Like a positive shin angle or a negative step. I'm like, I was so lost. And then finally one day it clicked. It takes time. But some coaches are never exposed to the movement stuff. So I do think it's super valuable. Maybe it's, how do you find a quality coach? Well, I just think you have to have that trusted network. And sadly, sometimes it's like you just fall into it. Like my mom, she met this guy at the gym, right? And he happened to be a former athlete that went to this track and field school that learned how to move well. And so she got me connected with him. Now, she might have had some sense, but like I had other buddies that just went to someone that might have been more of a power lifter. This guy got super strong, but when it came to movement, were they actually moving well? No, not really. That's a tough one.
I mean, I think it's unique, and I think we do have a decent amount of young strength coaches that I think, for me personally, I think Lucas was like one of the first people in this area that I saw with the emphasis of speed and movement over like strength. Like we've talked about before, is that like you started on like a park.
Yeah.
So you don't have all this equipment, but you still were getting kids stronger, more athletic, faster. And I think for a younger strength coach, I think that's like a huge piece of advice is like get good at the movement. Because it's pretty easy to, go online, how to get stronger. There's going to be a program that pops up, and you could probably do that program progressively for a year, and you're going to get stronger.
Yeah.
But can you move well? Can you do those things? Like that's, I think like what you're saying. 'Cause like I personally, the exact same thing you said is like the movement aspect of it took me longer to understand. Now I knew what good movement looked like, but how to coach that is like a whole different thing.
How to get in that position.
And then how to relay it to, a group of 12, 15-year-old like female
right.
athletes, trying to relay to them the importance and how to get into positions. And they might be, it's a tough task. I mean, you've done it great, so I'm sure you could talk more about it.
I think what's nuanced too is, a high school athlete who's like, okay, how do I best prepare myself? Speed, obviously, like you said, should be the number one priority, but also as far as the weight room and lifting, and strength training, how does that relate to your speed? How does that coincide with what you're doing as far as your change of direction, your agility, your speed, and your technical and skill work? How does all that relate to what you do in the weight room? And that's kind of a battle that I fight a lot with athletes who, a lot of them want to lift, and I think that's a good thing. Yeah, we should lift. You should lift. But how does that relate to your movement on the field? How does that relate to how you sprint and how you cut? And then also, how do you manage the volume of both, right? And so I think finding a qualified strength coach is important who can put all those pieces together, because the athlete, they just don't know all of that. And to me, stress is stress. So how do I manage the stress of the weight room and of the speed 100%. And dosing the right volume? And that's where I see a lot of gains, I think, with high school athletes is when they really buy into that and understand that, look, it's not all about lifting. It's not all about, your skill work. It's not all about just sprinting. It's like, how do you put it all together? That's where something special happens, in athletic development and long-term athletic development. In doing that, you start that in 8th grade or 9th grade, right? And you do that for 4 years, how much better you're going to be prepared for what you're doing now and in college and, potentially beyond. I think starting that as soon as possible is really, really key to offset sports specialization and burnout, and getting on a qualified program that can develop you as an athlete first and then as a soccer player second, incorporating speed, change of direction, strength, and weight room and all that, which I don't think is being done enough at the youth level. And I think you could speak to that too about, the U.S. model maybe compared to the European model as far as soccer development. There are some challenges, in the United States as far as the volume of play and club play and all that. But can you touch on that a little bit? Is what should an athlete do who's, who lives in the United States, who's trying to do the right thing, but the demands of soccer are so much that they can't fit in quality speed training or strength training,
There's a few variables here. The first one is that you do have to work at your sport a lot, right? Soccer, Jared, basketball is probably shooting free throws for hours and hours a day. So you do have to put in that skill repetition. What I think is going too far is that the athlete works in the skill with their training session, but then they hire a skill coach to do more shooting, right? Or they hire to do whatever. And typically it is shooting, and I just think shooting is overdone. So you like athletes like, my hip flexor, I pulled it because I was lifting. It's like, well, you actually just took 60 shots out there. And in a game, you're probably taking 3 or 4 shots. And so you're doing 60 shots 4 times a week. That's so much volume, right? When I worked at LAFC, we would actually take just a hand clicker and like count how many shots guys were taking just to educate them and say, hey, today you took about 12 shots in training and now you want to take 20 free kicks. I get it. You want to take the free kick and you have to work on that, but let's just have a conversation how your body's feeling. We're not going to tell those guys don't do that, right? That's what makes them a lot of money. But we do need to have a conversation on how much are you doing, or if you missed a shot in the last game, are you going to take 50 shots in training on Monday? Let's just figure out a way to microdose that. So when it comes back to the high school athlete, the college athlete, how can we best prepare them or advise them? I think that's the first thing is like, what are you adding with your extra time, right? There's just no unlimited amount of time. You have a very finite amount of time in your athletic career, but also just on a weekly basis. And so how do you want to spend that? So if you're already focused on the training and you do a little bit more with a skill coach, well, maybe 2 more sessions with that skill coach isn't the answer. That's where I say, okay, how can we add in the speed or the strength, right? Usually the S&C stuff will take a little bit less time, right? You might spend 2 sessions a week, 30 to 45 minutes, depending on what it is. The speed stuff, I think, takes a little bit more time because you have to rest. It does take a lot of time to coach the movement and stuff like that. So I think that kind of stuff is important. Real quick, just because we're talking about like what are those variables for the athletes, things that you can upgrade yourself on is like sleep and nutrition. Athletes are always telling me, oh, I'm falling asleep in class every day. Well, are you getting enough sleep at night? I understand homework is a thing, okay? But you're telling me you're going to bed at 1 a.m. and because you couldn't get your homework done. In some cases, I'm sure that's true. But in other cases, when I talk to athletes, you know where the library is? No way, I'm not going to the library, man. I'm like, well, why not? Like, why don't you just like 1 lunch a week? Don't go out with your friends, go to the library. And they're like, oh, that's not cool. Or like, oh, I just can't focus. And it's like, no, you don't want to focus. But wouldn't you rather get it done then than at midnight be stressing out, did I finish my homework? So I think things like that will afford you more time to do the stuff you want to do. Okay, I want to get stronger. Great. Now you have time to go to the gym because your homework's done, right? Or you're not going to have so much homework after the gym or whatever it might be. Obviously, nutrition's a key point. We don't need to go super deep onto that. But you can kind of get a sense of the general things you should be doing, right? Am I drinking the right things? Am I getting the right fluids in? Am I eating carbohydrate? Because for soccer players, it's a sport that really demands that. When am I eating my carbohydrate? If you want to go deeper, I'm sure you guys have different dietitians or nutritionists that you guys subscribe to that you can put in the notes for all your listeners. But I think things like that are important to think about. Okay, if I really want to get really, really good at my sport, and that 90 minutes that I play in the field, or whatever it may be, well, what am I doing to build up to that moment? And if you can think through that stuff and work backwards, make a plan, write it down on paper. And if you write that stuff down and you consistently hit it, you're going to see that stuff add up over time.
Yeah, I mean, that's super interesting. As you were talking, like the biggest thing is like, the big thing I do now is like basically stress consolidation, just like organizing stress. Where is it going? How much is it? Are we too high, too low? And when you guys were talking, the thing I was thinking about the most is like, and I'm sure you've dealt with this. Like I've had so many soccer athletes come to me that have practice, their own skill coach, their own speed coach, and then their own strength coach. And it's like you're divvying up, let's say, an hour of that time to each of those people. And then most soccer teams nowadays practice 3 times a week for 2 hours, roughly,
yep.
In the club setting. So it's just interesting to think about that, that whole model and like, I don't really know if there's an answer. We've talked about this a ton.
Yeah.
Like the club soccer model. Like I don't know if there is an answer to like fix it.
Well, see right there what you said. Remember we talked about the board of directors or like having your advisors?
Yeah.
You just said speed coach, strength coach, skill coach. You got your club coach, all that kind of stuff. You just gave 5 people a seat at the table. That's a lot of voices talking, right?
Yeah.
So like that's for the individual. For the club soccer landscape, oh man, this is a crazy one. This is just my own personal views. There's way too many tournaments. Like I understand it's a business, right? You show up to the tournament, you make money, club's got to pay for it, all that kind of stuff. But like if I was advising a club, I do know that development is key, but I think that athletes are playing way too many tournaments this year, right? Or this season or this time of life, whatever it might be. And so I might tell them, look, I know that the more exposure you get to these tournaments, it gets more exposure to your club and to your athletes, right? They want that. But sometimes you have to protect the athlete from themselves, which we know, right? The athlete wants to do more and more, and sometimes we have to say, hey, let's pull back a bit. I think if we took away just a few tournaments throughout the year, not only would that travel stress go down, but the athletes probably would have a little bit more, be more refreshed on a weekly basis. So that's, I think, is one of the biggest things is scheduling. Plus, when you go to the tournament, it's like 5 games in 2 days. That just seems like your body's breaking down so much. And the teams typically don't have the rotation of players where they can rotate and say, okay, you're going to play 2 games, you'll play 2 games, you guys will kind of figure out the last one. And so I think, obviously working in the pro setting too, we look at the game schedule and we talk about like match density, how many games are in a week, that kind of stuff. If we ever told our athletes to play 5 games in 2 days, they would just be like, there's no chance, right? Maybe 1 game in 2 days. With LAFC one time, we had to play a game at home and with the schedule on a Friday. And then on that Sunday, we had to play in Houston. And it was one of the shortest recovery times we ever had. And we didn't have this massive roster at the time available that we could do that. But it was what the league set up, right? We had to just go play. And so that was a situation where you think back and you're like, if I didn't have to be in the situation, we wouldn't, right? We went there, we ended up winning the game. Really cool stuff. But the athletes, they were exhausted, right? They had to travel 3 hours to Houston, play that game. Game got delayed because of weather. As you know, in Houston, there's always game delays. Finish the game at 1 a.m, fly back, get back at 5 a.m. back in LA. And you just think about like all this stress that we can control by taking out these tournaments for some of these younger athletes. And for parents, I don't know what you can do nowadays. Like when my kids get there, can you say my kid's not playing in this tournament? I know there's politics to it all, but like, I want my kid to play 30 to 40 games a year. Right now with the schedule, we have 60. Talking with the coach, there's 20 less games. So I'm sure that's a huge controversial topic because pulling your kids out of tournaments is going to be tough. As a parent right now and as a coach, I have the background where I know what that does to the body. I'm probably pulling my kid out of a bunch of tournaments and telling the coach ahead of time, here's how I want to set up the best development for my kids. See how that goes when we get to that point, though.
And I think it's just taking ownership. But it
100%.
comes from a background of knowledge. So I think if an athlete can understand this, or parents, then they'll set themselves up for success and reduce risk of injury, and just taking ownership of your own development, which I think is really important to do, especially nowadays when there's a lot of different competing demands for their attention and time. You need to take ownership of what you are going to do and what's best for you, not in a selfish way, but just in a smart way, in a responsible type of way.
Let me add something real quick right there. This isn't a plug for anyone that owns a gym or not a plug for you, but this is really what I believe. I do some remote coaching, and whenever I have athletes sign up, I only do 12-month commitments now. And I think if someone's coming to a gym like you, of course they want to trial it out at first. But for me, I would tell them like it's a minimum 6 or 12-month commitment. Like you're committing to development. And I actually think they should have some sort of it where they're committing to consulting as well, right? I don't just want you to coach me on speed and strength. You are an expert at the human body of managing stress, right? I want to pay you for the entire season. Anytime we have a question, look at our schedule to manage my kid's schedule. Now, it's probably going to cost a lot of money, but you will save so much money when they're not injured, right? Because they can just play. Your kid's going to be happier. They're going to develop better. If they could, I would say sign up with you for 4 years, right? My kid's 14. For the next 4 years, I want them to train just here. You and I know, we all know that's going to help them develop so much, not bouncing around from coaches. They're focused on one coach that they work really well with. I think that would change the game. Now, will parents pay for 4 years up front? No. But can they commit and say, yeah, for 4 years I'm going to go here. I'll pay every 3 months, whatever that might be. That's how I would set it up in the future.
That would be ideal.
I know, right?
I mean, we've talked about that so many times, but because I think I just always go back to like, how do you help from us probably both as like the female athlete. That's why I worked with the most female soccer. When I start to break down their schedule, it's what you're saying. It's absolutely insane. But then when I think about like what we used to do, it was insane. But now, more educated, I look at different things differently. But I mean, to break down their schedule a little bit is like we've talked about, is like you have club, and then there's also a window where club and high school go at the same time. And high school, like what I saw at least, was like the high school coach and the club coach would just butt heads the whole time. And then so they would basically do 5 days a week high school practice, 3 days a week club practice, and then 5 games on the weekend. And it was because, again, and what you're saying makes complete sense, and I think it's super valuable for the listener, is that it was two coaches with, quote unquote, an ego that their program was better or they needed to practice. And if they don't practice, they can't play for my team. If they don't go to club, they can't play in this showcase, versus like the athlete in front of you. Like, what's the best for this human being? And I've seen, I think the last year that I was with a club team, I think we had our most injuries during that time because just workload spiked like absolutely insane. I would ask some of the high school girls and be like, hey, what are you doing? They're like, we had 5 a.m., 5 a.m. this morning, we had to run 5 miles on the track, and then I had school, and then I had club, and then I had to go to high school practice at night. And I'm like, you're just dead.
Yeah, I saw 2 ACLs last year during high school season.
In that period, yeah. And like you just said, like the 5 a.m., like we're talking about athletes and their parents hiring guys like us, right? But I think the next thing is, like we're in Westlake right now, right? The high school should make sure they have an S&C just for soccer, right? Like get all those parents, put together whatever it is in your booster money and go hire Lucas, right? Go hire you and say for this season, even if you don't show up in person, like we just want consulting. What should we be doing? Because like the whole 5 miles at 5 a.m., you think that high schooler went to bed at a reasonable time where 5 a.m. makes sense? No, right? But we're going to make them wake up earlier and on time, which is going to stress their body out even more. You're not actually going to develop them. You're just going to break them down. Like we all know training is catabolic, right? Playing the sport is. It's just breaking us down. We're trying to recover from the sport all the time. So a 5 a.m., 5 mile session or whatever it may be, that's not necessarily going to help the athlete, right? Is there better times today to do it? Totally different subject, but I just think, again, like how can we get everyone on the same page and together? Because if development really is the goal, that's what it should be.
That feat just, to me, it seems so far away right now. And I don't know. I always try to, whenever we have these conversations, I always leave and I'm like, or in these conversations, like, what are the solutions?
I think there's got to be some sort of conference. Every single niche, like we have our own conference as strength and conditioning professionals, right? And then like these high school soccer coaches, they'll have their conference, whatever it is. How can we integrate the two or have a conversation, come into the weight room, or even it's just it's just a free gathering. Let's have a conversation. Like all you want to do is like you want to educate about how you would incorporate conditioning into a preseason for high school.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like when you were saying the whole like high school and club, the athletes play too much. The athletes that I'm working with, their parents say, okay, how are we going to do the S&C this month? I honestly tell them, you're not going to pay me because I'm not going to give you any S&C. Like people are like, oh, it's a horrible business decision. I'm like, no, it's not actually. Because they still pay me for consulting to deal with how they're going to play high school and club, to which I tell them, just choose one, right? Or talk to your club coach and say, I'll come once a week, and talk to your high school coach and say, I'll come 4 times a week, right? So it's just like having that conversation. Then the athletes, the parents end up trusting you long term, right? Because you see you have their best interest. But honestly, like we're talking about stress management, lifting weights during that period. If you want to do both those things, like I don't want to be a part of the injury process.
Right.
Come back to me when you're ready to like schedule things down a little bit.
All right, so I'm gonna change things up a little bit before or off that topic. Is we've talked about this before. Listeners know Daniel was one of my mentors. I think that's it. Another piece of advice that we've talked about as young strength coaches is find mentors that are maybe doing stuff that like you want to do or learn from. And Daniel was huge for me during COVID. Is it during COVID? I think COVID we did about like 5-6 weeks. And another big thing is pay people for their time. Don't just kind of ask for free. And it was an amazing experience. We talked about a lot, kind of conversations like this. But one of the things that we talked about in the soccer world, it was back when I was working with the club team and I was trying to figure out a lot of stuff that we're talking about. It's like, how do I manage all this stuff? How do I get them sprint work in? How do I get them conditioned enough for the sport? And one of the things we talked about was like sprint capacity and like the ability to play 90 minutes versus like velocity sprinting and top speed sprinting. And I think that's something that gets lost a little bit. If you want to kind of review maybe a little bit of what we talked about, if you
so I think
what I was talking about.
No, on that note, it was a good experience for me too, because definitely in COVID, everyone had their own challenges and we were able to have as much connection. And so to be able to walk through, really it was just guided direction with Jared and give you some sort of sense like, hey, you want to improve. That was your biggest goal. Like, how can I just get better in these next 2 months, 3 months? And I was like, yeah, I can sign up for that. And the fact that he was like, look, I want to pay for your time. And at first I was like, I don't know if I need to accept money. But you will work harder if someone's paying for your time because you feel like you owe them something, right? They paid you, you have to return back. So I do think that's a huge thing. I've done that as well with other people where I say, hey, let me pay for your time, whatever it might be. And then they present their cost. And if it's a value, then you take it. On the soccer side, when it comes to sprinting, so the hamstring muscle group is the #1 injured muscle group in the world. FIFA's got this injury study that they do every single year. And every single year, hamstrings are still the top, right? No one's been able to solve it. It just keeps going up. Well, if you look at sprint distance and high-intensity sprinting distance, those volumes have gone up over the past decade. So we know sprinting's important. We know how you sprint's important, and the volume which you do it is really important. And so kind of the stuff that we talked about was understanding the needs of the game. Just like in anything else, if you prepare for the demands of the game, then when you actually play the game, you'll not only be at a reduced likelihood of injury, but you'll also be able to perform at your best. What happens a lot of the times is that in a game, you're exposed to so much volume of sprinting in soccer, but in your training sessions, maybe you don't get that because you play a certain style of game where it's very small-sided, or there's just not opportunities to sprint. You think you sprint a lot in soccer and training, but you rarely hit max velocities in training. You actually need to push yourself to hit that max velocity. So there's two different things here. The first thing is the volume of sprinting. Well, how much do I do? Well, I kind of think like there's two different types of sprinting. There's the sprinting where you're just kind of driving on the freeway. You know, if you're driving the speed limit like 65 miles an hour, your car can handle that. You can do it all day long. And then we talk about like top end sprint distance, right? That's like you pushing 90% of your max, maybe even a little bit lower threshold, like 80%, but you're still pushing that sprint distance. And those are two different volumes. That max velocity sprinting is going to be way more sensitive, and so you might need to do a whole lot less there. With some of the pro guys, they might hit somewhere between like 100 to 300 meters of sprint distance in a game, 300 being pretty high. You have some outliers that hit way higher than that. But those are pros that are hitting that in a game. And so you think 100 meters of maximum sprint distance, right? That's one football field. I can do that in one sprint. And so this is where I'm going back to the whole Instagram thing. If you see someone say box-to-box sprints at 90% for 20 minutes, I'm thinking, well, that's potentially 20 times a game load. And so you're wondering why your hamstrings are on fire is because that's just way too much sprinting for what you're meant to be doing, right? So we work backwards from there. We think about with your sprinting, if you were doing 100 to 300 meters of sprinting in a game, well, and then the training week building up to that, you need to be doing at least 2 times that sprint distance, right? So if you're going to do 300 in there, let's try and get another 300 in the training week spread out. That way you'd go 600, something around there. Now it's individual for everybody, but that's a formula that we're going to look at when it comes to the sprint distance volume. That lower stride out more when you're thinking about running from sideline to sideline in a typical field in about 12 to 13 seconds. If you do that exact run, it's not quite a sprint, but you feel like it's a good stride. You still need a bunch of that distance too. That's protective. That's going to happen in a game a lot. You might get 1,000 meters of that in a game. But those numbers are different for everyone. So here's the formula that you work back from. What position do you play in the field? If you play in the outside, right, outside back, wingers, maybe you're outside midfielder, depending on what it is, you're going to have a lot of sprint distance, right? Even if you don't measure it, you just know you sprint more than the people in the spine. Center backs, center midfielders, sometimes center forwards, they are not going to be exposed to as much sprinting, especially the center midfielders, because center midfielders are controlling the game. They are staying in a certain radius of the field where they're doing a lot of running, but it may not be high-speed running, right? So the people that play in the center of the pitch, center back, center midfield, center forwards, they still need to sprint, but they might have a little bit less sprint requirements than the people on the outside, which is completely fine. But you have to know that about yourself so that if the coach says, hey, you play outside back, you need to sprint a little bit more, that's not a punishment. They're actually just trying to set you up to be better prepared in the game. So there's understanding your position, and then there's understanding yourself as an individual, right? I just said as a center midfielder, you may not sprint as much because of the demands of the game, but you personally just might be sprinting all over the place. You might just be that person that roams around, you go everywhere. Okay, well, maybe you do need more sprinting, right? So you don't quite fit the model. And it's important to know those two things. Now, if you really want to get specific, wearing something like a GPS pod can give you those measurements. But again, you need to hire a coach who can walk you through and see, okay, how much am I sprinting? So like Lucas, if you know someone's sprinting 300 meters in a game, you're like, okay, you sprint a lot in a game. We should really work on max velocity, right? Like movement's going to be so much more important. So I think working through those two things is going to be pretty valuable. The last thing I'll add, because we're talking about hamstring injury and sprinting, is that if you can do the right amount of sprinting, if you can understand your position and understand what you need to do, well, there's also a huge argument for strengthening your hamstrings, which we can do in the gym, right? Whether that's hip dominant movements or knee dominant movements. Some people like Nordics, some people don't. Like we were just talking about before, like some people hate Nordics, right? It's not about like, do I love or hate this exercise? It's about what movement does my coach think is going to give me the best results for high force movements on the field. And I think that's kind of the conversation we're having around hamstrings. And if people can do those things right, then they put them in a better spot for the games.
Yeah, and I think basically what you're describing is you need to train to match the demands of the game.
100%.
Individualize to potentially even what position you play.
Yep.
So I think it's just good training and understanding, your physiological load and your total stress that you have to withstand in the game, and train to match those demands. I think that's just smart training, Can you talk about speed reserve a little bit and how improving maybe your max velocity output can help you within the duration of a game to run faster, but kind of at a lower, quote unquote, physiological load?
Yeah, definitely. Well, let's start out. I would say most young athletes who are listening to this, you have not hit your max speed potential. I think the thing that we heard a lot as kids, what do they say? Like, you can't teach speed. I was told that so many times. Luckily, I was fast. But like, oh, you can't teach that. We all know that you can teach that, right? And so by improving those qualities and actually training your max velocity potential, whatever that might be, other parts of that speed paradigm is going to improve as well. Of course, if you're working different types of fly-ins and stuff like that, you might miss the acceleration portion a little bit. But if you're working some dead start sprints, and so you're going to get through the acceleration phase into max speed sprinting, that's going to improve everything else. And that's what we want to do. We want to try and raise the level of everything, right? If that's that stride distance, without getting too technical of what that speed might be based on a GPS pod, but the stride distance, the sprint distance, all that's going to improve by working through that speed mechanics. And if that improves and your acceleration improves, well, now we have a whole new player, which is what we want.
Right, and you won't be working as hard, right? If your top end
100%.
speed is, you improve it by 3 miles an hour over an off season if you're a high school athlete, then your lesser speeds at 70, 80, and 90, you're not working as hard, but you're moving faster. Which I think is a really important component of getting faster. And the importance of getting faster, not only is it going to help your speed, but you're going to be in a better position in a game, right? You're going to be able to be 2 or 3 steps faster while not having to do a max velocity sprint.
Yeah.
So
especially later in the game too,
right,
when people get fatigued.
Right. Improving your total max speed is really important for, I think any athlete on the field,
Yeah, no, I would agree with that too. The last thing I would say about a max speed is that, a lot of times now on social media with our buddies, we want to say, oh, I'm fast. Here's my max speed. I'm faster than you. I think what you should focus on is not necessarily being the fastest on the team, which is 100% against what I used to believe as an athlete, but it's how can I improve my own max speed, right? How can I improve my mechanics? If I am playing better, and like you said, we might both sprint at 32 kilometers an hour, or maybe we're sprinting at 9 meters per second, or whatever metric you want to use, right? But if I can do that more times than you can do that, I'm going to beat you in the game every time. You know what I mean? And so by working the things of like proper recovery through your sprints and proper strength training to help be durable on the field, that's going to improve the capacity to do all these things more times than the other athletes.
And here's what I do when I'm doing a typical speed session with an athlete is I like 1 minute of rest for every 10 yards sprinted. Is that a good metric, do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a great one. I mean, you're giving more rest than probably a lot of coaches would give. Typically, coaches get too impatient, and so it's like, 10 seconds turn around. But I think like when we're talking about that distance, the body's able to recover with more than enough time, and you could even go longer. I remember working with Bob Bradley at LAFC, and he wanted to really implement the sprint training. He was a huge believer into it, which is great for us. And I was a little bit nervous, like, okay, I want to do 6 sprints today after the warm-up, which, isn't a whole lot, but I just knew that was a good dosage for what they're going to do in the training session. And so I went to Bob with the whole plan, and I said, okay, Bob, we're going to do these 6 sprints. They're going to be 12 yards apart, but I want to have a lot of recovery. And I was really nervous, and Bob's a really smart guy. And I was like, okay. He's like, how long is this whole thing going to take? And I'm like, it's going to take about like 12 minutes, which I know was a huge part of his training plan. And he was like, no problem. And I was like, oh, really? That was easier than I thought. And he's like, well, I understand you need proper rest. Like, he really got that. If you're going to sprint with max intent, even 12 yards every time, you have to rest a good amount of time. So we went out there. Athletes couldn't believe it. They'd sprint. I was like, you guys got to wait for a good amount of time, Like 1 to 2 minutes, you're going to take your time. And eventually we had a really good protocol where we were doing, like 2 sets of 5 accelerations at 10 to 12 yards apart, because that was the one thing we were missing. We weren't getting in training. And Bob was watching every single sprint. He was encouraging guys. We just had a really good thing going that year in 2019, which carried into, 2020, 21. So if you get a coach that really believes in the rest period and is patient with that, that changes everything. And
I think you touched on the warm-up. I'd love to get into that a little bit and how you added those sprints at the end of the warm-up. I think that's super valuable, which I think more coaches should do, and more strength coaches should advocate for. And I think they did that a lot at TCU football. I saw a video that kind of went viral that did that. But can you touch on that a little bit? Number one, what's a good warm-up, and how do you add qualities as a strength coach into the warm-up that you can train for speed, you can train for other things? Can you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, so what is a good warm-up? It's a great question. I think the people that can answer that is not just the coach, but also the athlete. You got to ask the athlete, just in a very general sense, were you warm? Did you feel prepared for what was coming next? I always ask the coaches, what do you want to do in the session? They would say, I want to play big field. I say, okay, here's how much time I need in the warm-up so I can prepare them for that first drill that's coming. If the athletes are not prepared for that first drill, then no, it wasn't a good warm-up, right? So we have to make sure that they really feel prepared for that. Now, what do they need for whatever it's coming? Let's talk about a sprint session. If my goal at the end of the warm-up is to do near max velocity accelerations at 12 to 15 yards, then my whole warm-up is going to be focused on that. Now, in the soccer setting, we're kind of doing everything because we want to prepare them for striking a ball and the movements they're going to see. But I know that they have to be ready for that near maximal sprint. And so what we're going to do is everything focused on that. So if it's accelerations in that day, of course, I'm going to have some sort of general movement prep, right? Could be all the regular soccer stuff, side shuffles, jogging, skipping, leg swings, all the stuff that I think just gives them the sense of like, okay, this is comfortable, this is familiar. But then I want to work a little bit on mechanics of what they're going to see. So that could be some specific skipping that's going to be specific to acceleration, certain angles we might be doing, might bring out some bands. What's some things that can start to get their mind thinking, okay, everything we're going to talk about today is a positive lean. That's all we want to focus on. There's a bunch of things we could fix, but that's the one thing we want to focus on. And we're going to hit that every single second on the warm-up. Of course, we have to do dynamic flexibility. I don't think we have to just do a few specific things that are going to be geared towards acceleration. We're going to hit everything. But I always try and think, can we get something anterior hip, posterior hip, lateral hip, global hip, something in the back, really open up everything so that they feel comfortable there. And then lastly, before we do the accelerations, I want to do something that is on a continuum of non-reactive to reactive. So I choose something that is non-reactive, right? Sprint from point A to point B. Or we want you to go through this little slalom, whatever it might be. I don't really care what that is. I try and find out what are the coaches like, what are the athletes like. But as we get to the reactive stuff, I know that my drill is going to be reactive off an audible cue. It's going to be a whistle. That's what I'm going to use. I want them to be at a dead start, an audible cue, and go from there. So backtracking from there, I might do a game of tag or chase. Something that's going to be fun for them, but also that they're going to give an effort without thinking, right? So if I have someone that's going to line up, if I'm on the line, and they're going to line up 2 yards in front of me, but I'm going to have them face me, I'm going to say, okay, as soon as I clap my hands, you have to tag that person. The goal is to get 10 yards away, right? Well, I don't have to tell them to sprint hard. They don't want to get tagged, right? And they want to get the other guy. So when we do that stuff, it just initiates that response where they know they have to get ready a little bit more without me saying, okay, sprint as hard as you can, or you're not trying hard enough. We just set it up like we're having games. So by the time I get to the sprint, I can see they're sweating. I can see that they've actually given about 3 or 4 efforts pretty hard. And then I can tell them, okay, we're on the whistle. We're going to film some of these sprints. There's a different subject. We want to give the players some feedback there by filming it. But then by going to the whistle, they're all ready. Everyone's on the whistle. I have 25 guys. We set it up, 5 different sprints, 12 yards apart across the field with appropriate rest distance and rest time. And we can get through that next period in about, whatever it is, 6 to 7 minutes, which is great.
And that's the warm-up before a sport practice.
Yeah, 100%.
That's not even a structured speed session, which obviously will be more of a
that's just
extensive
like
warm-up.
Getting the very bare minimum we can that they need, because the track is the biggest part, right? That's cool.
Love it. Well, I wanted to get your reaction to a certain video that Jared and I sent to each other this past week on an NFL coach and what he said to his team. And I don't want to tell you what it is yet. I want to just get your raw reaction to it. Just tell me what you think, and then hopefully, we could talk about the implications of what this means.
Bring it up, bring it up, bring it up. So, look, here's what I got to get across, guys. I had a couple of you look at me like, what the f***, why are we going live? I swear to God, I'm not a lunatic. I swear to you. And if I absolutely knew we could get to where we need to get without ever putting pads on, I'd do it, I swear to you. I don't want to put anybody in jeopardy. However, I do know this. The studies say you got to get volume and you got to get intensity before a season comes. You have to. If you don't, I'm not getting you prepared, not only physically for injury, but also for us as a team to get better. Defensively, what is the essence of what we do, man? What are the 2 things? Pursuit and tackle. Pursuit and tackle. Man, if you don't work on tackling, if we don't work on run after catch, making a move, Man, what are we doing, man? Then we finally get to week 8 and we come to life because we got enough reps. But I'm telling you, honestly, I'm doing this because it actually does help you with injury if we do it the right way. And we're not going to do it every day. But I got a plan, I swear to you. All I think about is you guys. That's all I think about, man. That's all I think about is you guys and how I set you up for the best possible advantage I can give you to have a season. I swear to you, man. I just need you to trust me. That's all. Please.
So I thought that was pretty cool. What's your reaction to that?
That's pretty rare, I think. I see what he's trying to say at first is that the past is that coaches want to rest. We don't want to push very hard. We don't want to keep everyone healthy. And I get that in training, that's where you get exposed for the most injuries. But he's basically saying this is what's going to come. These are the demands that are going to come for the game. And so we have to train for those demands. And the fact that I think he was real with the guys and he just said, look, I don't want to get you guys injured. I don't want to put you in jeopardy. But what I'm actually doing is going to prepare you better and put you at a reduced likelihood because you're going to be exposed to what you're going to see. I just think that was awesome.
Yeah, and I thought it was really cool, especially because he's sitting there trying to explain it. And that's not something that you get from him, so he kind of has a reputation. But when I saw that, I totally changed how I thought about him, not in a negative way, but just like, wow, he's really bought in to what they're trying to do there and communicating that to the players and then truly trying to be counterintuitive about how do we prepare to play the game at a high level and reduce risk of injury, especially non-contact injury, you know?
Yeah, no, definitely. That's I'll have to save that clip. It's pretty powerful. When I'm just thinking through, the best coaches I've ever worked with are the ones that would push the athletes hard. They would know when to push. Of course, there's times where you want to take it down and recover, but you also have to train yourself hard. And I think sometimes we have this pendulum swift in strength conditioning where, like, we are constantly trying to shift in between these massive extremes, right? But I think, like I tell people, you got to be swifty. Like, you got to be able to, like, understand when's the time to really go for that extreme or not. And so the coaches that have worked really well are the ones that actually push their athletes, and training's hard. Like at LAFC, when we worked with Bob Bradley, he would push these guys hard, but it's because he wanted them to be prepared for the games, and he knew the same thing. Studies will show you have to be exposed to that intensity. That's just huge.
And you could touch on this, Jared, but this is what we talked about at the beginning in the NBA with Stan Van Gundy and his tweet, because they're kind of interrelated.
Yeah.
You know, what's kind of your reaction to that, Jared?
Yeah, I mean, the first one on that is football is, like, especially with, like, one of the points he was getting about was, like, tackling. And, like, there's a lot with concussions and all that stuff nowadays that I forget who I was listening to someone else talk about it in the football world, and they were saying how he coaches, is an NFL player, I can't remember who, he coaches his son's team and he makes them tackle. And he had a meeting the first week with the parents because all the parents were freaking out, like, they don't need to tackle. And he's like, how am I supposed to teach your kid how to tackle the right way and take him out of a risk of injury if we never tackle or if we never do the skill? And so I think it's another thing he's trying to get at is, like, we got to be in pads, we got to tackle at high speeds at different things. But touch on the NBA, then Stan Van Gundy, it's interesting. I mean, I think PJF put it, like, the best way after, right. Like and Ramsey Nijim out of Kansas. There's just a lot of variables that go into such a simple statement of, like, these guys don't work hard anymore, these guys used to work harder. It's not that simple. One of the big things that PJF brought up that I've noticed is, like, the game of basketball, and I've talked about with my client a lot, is, like, the game of basketball itself has changed so much. And I think you kind of talked about that in the soccer world slightly of I think you're talking about more high speeds in the game of soccer. Like, I think the games are changing, especially in basketball. There's more, there's more drive lanes, so there's more distance for guys to attack. There's more attacks to the layup or to the hoop more consistently over time.
Deeper angles and faster.
Faster. It's just it's a different game. So it's not just as black and white as that these guys aren't working hard and these guys used to work hard. It's not that simple. And I think there's a lot more to digest and kind of get into on those topics. But I think what Daniel just said is basically what I do nowadays, is just try to kind of filter that, try to be as perfect line as possible between not too extreme and not too little, because if it's too little, it's a risk of injury. And if it's too much, you're also at risk of injury. So how can I manipulate what you're doing on a day-to-day from games, from practices, from training that puts you in the most optimal state when 7 o'clock rolls around and you got a game. Because there are a lot of teams in the NBA now that don't practice. You'd be surprised. Like there's a lot of teams that all they do is walkthroughs.
Just like shooting stuff and everything?
Shooting, that's it. They don't practice at all. Because you got to understand that if you pulled up an NBA schedule right now, the schedule is crazy. And I never really understood that until I was like in it, traveling a little bit with it, just looking at the schedule, like you were saying earlier, like looking at the game week or looking at a 10-day period. I mean, there's teams that play 15 back-to-backs in a season. And that's back-to-backs where you're in LA one night and you got to fly to Utah, Texas, somewhere and play the next night at 7 o'clock. So that game's finishing at 10, 11. You got to get on a plane, fly to another state, another time zone, land at, say, 4 a.m., go to sleep, wake up, and you got a game at 7 o'clock the next day. There's also instances in the NBA where you do get 5 and 7s is what we call them, is 5 games in 7 days. Like there are these instances. So it is hard. I get both sides because as a coach, you want your guys to be able to play as many games. And so is your risk versus reward for one hard practice, or is it more valuable for your guys to rest?
Right, and I think that's why he made it such a great point, because this clip was in training camp.
Yeah.
The preseason loads, right? So there's not these spikes in workload, but preparing preseason and the offseason, that comes back to good training in the offseason and having a good plan, and then throughout the season, it's just preservation, right? Preserving what you've already built. What I think is just being strategic about how you train an athlete, and then getting the athlete and the coach and the whole team and staff and organization to buy into that. I think that's probably going to be the biggest change, but I think getting there is harder than it is to, just talk about.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard because it is very individualized when you come down to it. And, yeah, I mean, the NBA season's brutal. I mean, how many games do you guys play in soccer?
You have 34-ish league games, but you also have a U.S. tournament, U.S. Open Cup. You could be in Champions League, which is an international tournament. There's like Leagues Cup, so you could have upwards of like 50, 60 games, including preseason.
Basketball is 82 regular. It's a lot. So, I mean, I get both sides, but I think it's, I think that's where what you said in the very beginning is that in the offseason, guys go in different places, whatever. I think teams, you sometimes will lose what you're saying is like, where is every single person coming into this equation? Because there might be a guy that comes in a little bit behind.
Yeah.
And he might need a little bit more work in order to get up to speed with the team in order to reduce his risk of injury or just be able to be optimal for that setting.
Great point, yeah.
But then all of a sudden you're like, it's an off day, and that guy's like, it's an off day.
Yeah.
I'm not coming in. But there might be guys that do too much. It's tough. I mean, you also got to understand, it's very individualized, and you got to understand who you're in front of. I mean, there's some teams that have a lot of veterans on the team that maybe they don't need as much workload. They already have built this huge base of workload throughout their career and where they're at currently. And there might be some teams that are super young, and maybe they do need to go through a little bit more in order to be prepared for the game. It's different. It's challenging. But, I mean, it's fun at the end of the day.
You also learn, I mean, we've traveled with these teams too. U.S. travel is no joke. Like whenever we have the European soccer guys come here where they're used to taking trains a lot of the time or buses, and we're like, no, we have a 6-hour flight to Montreal today. They're like, 6 hours? What are you talking about? Oh, don't worry, we got to go to Florida next week, or we got to go to Houston, and the weather. It's like U.S. travel and climate is totally different. It's a tough game too.
It's crazy. I mean, the Clippers just had, I forget the exact stat, but I think they played 10 games in like 15 different time zones.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Like people like you can't really understand until you actually are in it, and like the effect and the stress.
Until you're
that
on
has,
day
that
9
you're
and
on a flight here,
tired of the hotel food.
6 hours across, and then you bounce back, and then you bounce down, then you bounce over, and you're not getting to bed till 3 a.m. at the earliest. And it's not because the guys don't want to go to bed at 10 o'clock. It's like you physically cannot go to bed.
No, your body has no idea what time it is.
Yeah, no idea what time it is. It gets pretty wild, but I mean, it's all fun. It's all part of the process, and it's all part of like preparing these guys to be as best they possibly can every night. It's a puzzle, and it's a challenge, but it's it's why we're in it, I think. Right.
So I think kind of just in conclusion, we're doing a new segment that we're calling just agree/disagree. It's kind of a lightning round. So I'm going to just give you a statement. I'm just going to read a sentence, and you can say one word on it. You can go short on it, long on it, however long or however deep you want to dive into it.
But you want me to choose a stance, agree or disagree?
Yeah. So that's what we're going to try.
Go in the middle.
No, it depends. I'm tired of the it depends on all these.
Yeah. You can do whatever you want. This is raw reaction, whatever it is.
All right, let's play.
All right, here's the lightning round. So agree, disagree. Olympic lifting is a waste of time for soccer players. Agree or disagree?
Olympic lifting by itself, yes, I think it's a waste of time. Time is super valuable. You don't have a lot of it with the players, especially in the weight room. I think there's variations you can do, but like I'd much rather just do a trap bar jump than teach a soccer player how to go through a hang clean. The ones that really want to learn, it's fun for me, but is it going to benefit them? I don't know.
I think that's an interesting conversation because, I have some athletes that really do want to do it, and they think that it's really going to be beneficial for them, and so I'll teach it to them. They say, hey, can we do this? Then yeah, let's add it into your program, and I have others that are totally against it. I think it's sport specific. I think it's context, specific, but yeah, cool. All right, next one. Individualization in terms of programming is overrated.
Disagree. I think individualization specific to the position they play needs to be considered, especially in a sport like soccer. Like if I don't individualize a goalkeeper from a center forward, then that's going to be a problem. So we have to think a little bit about individualization. Also, when you think about like individualized training, I think we're taking everything in consideration, like training history. If I train everyone the same, what about a vet that's got 10 years of training and someone who's a rookie out of college, They're going to need something a whole lot different. Also, like, if I don't individualize, if someone just had COVID, and I'm going to have them jump back in with a team. I just think, So I think individualization just needs to be considered all the time, as much as you can. Of course, there's time just to do general stuff, but you got to learn who the athlete is if you want to have the most success.
Right.
I think when people hear individualization, it's like you at LAFC running around wild trying to like every single person is doing so you have 25 athletes, so you have 25 specific programs. But I think what and a couple of times that I've seen you work is that the individualization might just come with like a squat. Like one guy might be doing, a heavy squat. One guy might be doing a chain squat, and one guy might be doing a goblet squat. Yeah. That's still individualized to that person.
I think we just call it personalized training now. How can I make it personal to that person?
Yeah. What they need, and that's based on everything that we've talked about today is who that person is, but it doesn't have to be like some crazy different exercise. It's like just by changing a heavy squat to maybe a lighter speed squat would be individualized for said person.
100%. Right.
Would you agree that there are more similarities than differences, though, in different sports and positional demands and things like that, in terms of individualized programming? More similarities than differences?
Yeah. I would say if I had a bunch of field sport athletes, their programming would probably look more similar than anything else. I mean, most of my athletes are going to go through some sort of split squat or unilateral progression to get to a point where I think they can load effectively and it doesn't crush their body. Not everyone makes it to rear foot elevate split squats for me. Some guys, it's too much. Some guys, they just stop at a regular split squat and that's all they need because they'll load it over time and we can use that. Other younger athletes, I might take them through the full progression because I want them to have the development and want them to learn what that feels like. But yeah, I'd say there's a lot of similarities across my programming.
Great. All right, next one. And this is for my high school athletes that are listening, or parents. Agree, disagree. Youth athletes or kids should not lift weights.
100% disagree. I mean, it depends on what you're qualifying as a youth athlete, right? But I think 8, 9, 10 years old, there's something they can learn. I've got my 4-year-old in the gym with me sometimes who will just look at me and wants to be just like me and is trying to figure out what I'm doing. And I'm like, why would I not coach her right there if she wanted to listen, right? It's not mean they have to force certain things on there, but I think this whole idea of if kids lift weight at a young age, it's going to stunt their growth. I think the research has proven that wrong. That's actually not the truth. Especially when we're talking about like bone density and stuff like that, it can only help them. It's just, again, coming back to having a good coach who knows how to progress volume and intensity in the weight room. So I got to disagree with that. I think kids got to do it.
Yeah, and the research is out, and it's been out for a long time, but the myth is still out there.
I know.
The myth is still out there with a lot of parents and coaches, too.
True.
That, no, it's going to stunt your growth. You should not lift. They give some arbitrary age. Oh, you can't do it until you're 13. Well, okay. Well, not every 13 is the same, right?
Exactly.
So they give some arbitrary age, but the research is out on that. It's been out for a long time. So I think it's important for people to hear,
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, next statement. Agree, disagree. Programming load based on percentage is outdated, and VBT is better.
Ooh, cutting me down to VBT. I think this is something that I think Jared's really good at, is you don't just rely on one metric or one type of training. I don't think that programming to percentage is outdated at all. I think it can be really useful, but I just think in the context of team sport, when you're trying to train 20 athletes at one time, it just may not be the most feasible option. And so you're trying to think, how can I best coach them? For some athletes, they might want that. For other athletes, I can just look at the weight and say, hey, you're on the green kettlebell today, right? It's a little bit heavier. They don't need to know how much heavier it is, right? And I can watch them move, and they feel good about it. I think the percentages probably have a lot of value when you're working with a very individual sport athlete, or if you have a lot of time with somebody and you really want to measure that. So no harm to anyone that does it. VBT is also useful, but it just depends on like who the athlete is. Like, why am I doing it for them? What's the purpose? If I want a certain intensity out of an athlete, then yeah, I might hook them up to a gym aware or something like that, whatever it might be, and say, hey, we want the bar speed at this exact speed for this movement for the next 6 weeks, right? I've done that before, and even then you can do it without coaching the athletes, where you say, you want to get it at this meters per second on the bench press, set all three up, and then the athletes can go and they put whatever weight they want, right? As long as they're hitting that speed. So I think there's a time and place for it. I guess I'm disagreeing, but I do think it's what's valuable.
Okay, maybe last one here. Last agree-disagree statement. And I think this is still out there. Again, maybe this is an easy one, maybe this is too easy, but this is one that I hear a lot still from athletes and parents. And specifically in the context of soccer. Lifting weights makes you stiff and or slower.
Oh, man, 100% disagree. And I do think you're right. It is still out there. I think it's just a conversation that has to be had a lot of the times. I mean, man, stiff, slower. I don't know where this stuff comes from, or where like these people
heavier.
are heavier. That's a whole other thing, but I don't want to get too big. It's like, do you realize how hard it is to gain muscle? Some people think it's so easy. Like, I'm going to bulk up, or I'm going to get so big. It is incredibly difficult to gain muscle. Talk to these bodybuilders about what they go through. For them to put on 7 to 10 pounds in a year, they got to work really, really hard of pure lean muscle, what we're talking about here. So, yeah, I would have to disagree with that one. I also think that the whole, like, I'm going to get slower. Well, if I'm stronger, if I'm able to put more force down for each step of my acceleration, it's going to make me faster, right? Force equals mass times acceleration. If you want to produce more force, you have to manipulate those two variables. So hopefully those parents are hearing that loud and clear from someone who's been there. I have the data with the athletes and the force plates and everything like that, but lifting weights is absolutely essential if you want to play, team sports these days. Doesn't mean that you can't play a sport without doing it, but the ones that do it, they're going to have a huge competitive advantage.
Yeah, I think that goes to what we were talking about earlier, though, is that I think the biggest issue there is just volume control. Like, I think a lot of like the stiffness, most like the stiffness and sore piece comes from like these athletes that do practice, skill training, speed training, and lift.
But they blame the lift, right?
But they always will blame the strength side. They'll be like, that's making me stiff, that's making me sore, that's making me extra tired, I can't play my sport anymore. And then all of a sudden, that's the first thing they get rid of, because they think just doing more skill work is going to make them better at soccer, but which it might, but it's not going to keep you healthy.
Yeah, when it comes to stiffness, look at everything else. We were just talking about travel too, right? Travel for youth athletes is a lot of driving in the car. They drive everywhere and like, oh, I'm so stiff from that workout you did. You're like, no, you just sat for 4 hours and then you played 5 games in 2 days. That's why you're stiff. The weights are only going to help you. And in fact, we know that we talked about the sport itself is catabolic. Well, lifting weights can be anabolic, right? From all the hormonal factors and how we're trying to develop the body. I mean, we do lifts on recovery days. Anytime it's like day after a game, 2 days after, we have the guys lift. Now, we control the volume. But we find that to be really restorative for the athletes. So hopefully parents and athletes are hearing that and they start lifting tomorrow.
And I think a lot of the conversation, too, is getting them to 180 their thinking on it, right? Is strength training going to make you stiff? And that's what they think. But you have to tell them, no, the best mobility training is strength training, right? So you have to almost flip 180 and get them to understand that. I think it's just having conversations and building buy-in and trust with the athlete and the parent, too, at the end of the day.
Yeah, agree.
Well, thanks so much for taking the time. I appreciate you, making the drive down here and doing this in person. I thought it was really valuable. So I appreciate the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. This is fun.